Okay, here we go. All right, everybody. Hey, how you doing? Welcome. It's Keith, and I'm here with my friend Jamie Arpin-Rici. Um, he and I, we were just talking before I hit record. He and I have been aware of each other for, I don't know, long time. We've been blogging about the same time, and always kind of on parallel tracks. But we've never talked. I don't think I've ever, I mean, I probably have commented on something you said. You probably commented on something I said, but that's about as far as it went, I think. So this is a great opportunity to just actually talk, at least over the internet, face to face. Jamie, welcome.
Thank you. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, good stuff. So for people that don't know a whole lot about you and what you've been doing and what you're about, can you just give us a little bit of a background on, about you and a little bit of your story and the kind of things that you're passionate about, that you like, you write about, and things you're involved in?
Sure. Yeah. So my family and I are located here on the prairies of Canada in the city of Winnipeg. We've been here for almost 20 years. I am one of the pastoral leaders at a church we planted about 11 years ago called Little Flowers Community, which is part of the Mennonite church here. We're people who largely locate physically in the inner city neighborhood, the west end of Winnipeg. And we've been sharing life together, both through our weekly worship, but also most of us do some form of kind of co-housing with one another, and so housing and mental health supports have been a big part of who we are as a community. I served with, my wife and I have been serving until the beginning of this year with an organization called Youth with a Mission, YWAM. I was with YWAM for 25 years. That ended at the beginning of this year. And I'm currently serving part-time as Director of Community for Central Canada for a ministry called Generous Space Ministries, which is an organization that works to dismantle religious-based harm, pursue intersectional justice, and celebrate LGBTQ lives in the church and in the world.
Oh, that's beautiful. Really, really cool. So just even hearing you talk a little bit about your background and things you're involved in, I can pick up on some of the things that you and I have some overlap. So, talking about doing these communities together, Mennonite, which means you're probably, you and I would agree on things like nonviolence and loving your enemies and that kind of a thing.
Yep.
And then affirming LGBTQ people, which I think is awesome and beautiful. And it carries a cost, unfortunately. All of those things do.
Yes.
Anytime you write about, I'm sure you like to tell stories, share very similar stories. Anytime you write about or speak out about any of those things, right? Like, hey, Jesus really was the Prince of Peace. He was serious when he wanted us to love our enemies. Or, you know what? Everyone's made in the image of God. God loves all of his children. Doesn't matter if they're gay or if they're trans or they're straight or anything else. You can be all of those things and love Jesus. Yeah, and anytime you make those kinds of statements, there's a pretty strong backlash from that, and I'm sure you've experienced that kind of thing.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. It's often fueled by kind of the ideological divide, that happens. But for me, especially around LGBTQ affirmation inclusion, it's very personal. I identify as bisexual myself, and even though I'm in a straight presenting marriage, which kind of exposes me to assumptions and people saying things that they think are safe to say to me, it's very personal, and and very painful when it comes from people who you're close to, especially.
Right. Absolutely. And this is what you're saying is thank you, by the way, for being honest and open about that. I know it's very difficult to, and you've already paid the price for a lot of that. But that kind of echoes my experience as far as probably 6 or 7 years ago when I wrestled with this issue for a while, of whether or not to affirm or not. And then I read tons of books on the topic. My sticking point were the scriptures. And so that was like, well, I wasn't comfortable. I reached a point where I wasn't comfortable with the way it felt, you know what I mean, to treat people differently because of their orientation. But so it didn't feel very Jesus-y to me. But I still was stuck on the, well, but you know, Romans says this and First Corinthians says that, and I don't know. And so it took me a while, but I eventually, I actually came across this book by, his name is Brownson.
Yeah.
Gender, I always forget the name of the book. Gender,
Sexuality, and the Bible, I believe
thank
it's
you.
called.
That's it. And that was the one that helped me. That was the one that really took seriously the scriptures. And the author is a Bible scholar. And he had never written on that topic before until his son came out to him. And then he felt like, well, okay, I need to get a grip on these. I need to understand these scriptures. So it really helped me. Anyway, but what I'm trying to say is, so once I finally did have that question resolved for myself, and then I started saying, hey, you know what, I'm going to affirm anybody, you know, whatever their orientation is. All of a sudden, I realized I had more gay Christian friends than I knew. Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so, but it was like I didn't find out until I became someone who was safe to talk to.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a very common experience people have is, and that's part of the saddest part of the experience for a lot of LGBTQ people, especially Christians, is that when they're in the closet, people just assume that they're straight and will say things in front of them, even if they believe them, that they might not say or say in that way if they knew. And that was one of my first experiences was people friends saying horrific things in front of me and not knowing. And that's the point, you know, you don't know. And so you have to assume that someone within earshot, or now in our social media age within screenshot, is going to be impacted by your words. And you know, hopefully people will increasingly understand the impact, even if their beliefs may not change. At least they recognize and have a bit of compassion about how those things hit people personally.
Right. Yeah. And then see, that was my experience. Yeah. I almost immediately experienced, I just had some amazing conversations with people. Again, I already was in connection with, I already had no doubt that they love Jesus, you know. I had seen and experienced, you know, without a doubt, Christ in them. And then had conversations with people around that time, and found out, oh yeah, I've struggled with my gender identity my whole life, or I'm bisexual, or I'm trans, or I mean, or I'm gay, and I had no clue. I guess I'm just like oblivious. It just, and honestly, maybe one of those people, I could have said, I think they're gay, but
Right.
almost everybody else, I had no clue in the world. And then you kind of, like you're saying, you kind of start playing tapes again in your mind, like, wow, have I ever stepped on their toes, or, you know, done or said something really thoughtless, because you know, at a time when I didn't really understand where I was at on this topic.
Yeah, absolutely. And to, you know, to be honest, as even though I identify as a queer person myself, I too step on toes all the time, because as much as I am, you know, part of a marginalized people group on one hand, I also occupy a heck of a lot of privilege in many other respects. And so it has been it is an ongoing journey of recognizing that even in my own life.
Yeah. And I want to say too, the other beautiful thing though about my experience, the more I've gotten to really know people who are gay or trans or queer or whatever, and they're Christian, and I've heard their stories consistently. When they're telling me their story, they'll tell a story about being rejected by family, by the church, by good friends, people, you know, their best friends in the world, and with tears in their eyes. I mean, they're just the most horrific, painful stories to hear of being rejected in the most horrible, profound ways.
Mm-hmm.
But in every case, I have seen those same people tell me, but I've forgiven them and I love them. And I'm like, and I see the grace of God and the love of Christ in my gay and trans and queer friends, way more than I see Christ in those that are doing the rejecting, you know?
Mm.
And that's been beautiful.
Yeah, and it has been something that has inspired me too, is to see the resilience and kind of fidelity of queer Christians in the midst of some of their suffering. It's not to say that there isn't anger or hurt
Sure.
or that we don't act out in ways that are inappropriate, but um, in the crucible of that kind of oppression and that kind of experience, oftentimes out the other side, you come to be more deeply connected, I think, to the suffering of Christ.
Yeah. And so, I mean, yes, it really makes me, it humbles me. I feel like I have so much to learn, and I have learned. I've been, even like you were saying, you still make mistakes. Like I do it all the time. Even when I first wrote the first series of articles that I wrote, trying to be affirming and trying to, I had at the same time I had some people who were friends of mine who were gay, who would very gently come to me and say, Keith, thank you for that article. I really appreciate your heart. Could you not use that word? Or, that phrase that actually is hurtful, or, maybe you should try it, say it this way. And so I was so grateful for how graciously, people came alongside me to help me. And, it wasn't like you loser, you idiot. It was like, it was very gentle and very, very loving and understanding. And I've really appreciated that. But I've learned, I've really appreciated the humility and the grace with which people have had grace for me through this process.
Yeah, and in our generous space community, we have a common statement that yes, there is a time to call people out, but more often than not, we can call people in, and it's a much more gracious and ultimately can be a more effective way of doing it. Now, there is a time and a place for the prophetic call out,
Yeah.
Yeah, when people have called me in, I think of my friends who are people of color calling me in on my well-intentioned yet still racist
Yes.
ideology.
Yes.
I am so grateful that they have been firm and clear with me. I'm a white man who's raising a black son, and so those lessons are incredibly important to me.
Yeah.
And without people who are calling me in, not only would I not learn, but my son would suffer. Right?
Yes.
So I'm
Yeah.
grateful.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. I think it is really beautiful when we can. I mean, there's a measure of humility we have to adopt ourselves, right? We have to be recognizing um, we don't have it figured out. We do make mistakes. We have a lot to learn, and maintaining that posture is so important. Because I've seen the sad thing is, I'm sorry, I don't want to get down this road too far, but I have seen, unfortunately, some Christian, authors or leaders or whatever, trying to do the right thing, trying to say it the right way, and not responding very well when they're corrected. And
Yeah.
then it ends up like imploding the whole thing. It's like, dude, come on.
Yeah. Well, and that's why, one of my passions, and I wrote an article recently about it, is why being affirming isn't enough.
Yeah.
Affirming is good, but affirmation is like your wedding vows. It's a stated intention that needs to be proven in action, right?
Yes.
And so moving from affirmation to allyship is a critical commitment that I think we all need to embrace.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow. So I'm curious. So are you okay? Are you comfortable? Like, I'm curious about the process that you went through. I mean, and forgive me if this is a stupid question. Did you always know that you were queer, or is it something that you struggled with your whole life, or is it something that kind of just came up, so later in your life? I'm just curious how
Yeah,
your awareness went.
sure. Yeah, no, I'm pretty open about my story. I have been for even before I had embraced an affirming belief. I'd been telling my story for a few years, but most of my gay friends, they knew early on, like really early on in their childhood, and I think not all, but some of my bi friends get that that's not always our story because I had a healthy attraction for women. It never occurred to me that I wasn't. I just assumed I was straight, and then in high school, near the end of my high school years, just hanging out with some guys. Some guys were joking about seeing the other person naked, and they're all like, "Ooh, disgusting!" And then my mind is like, am I supposed to say disgusting? Because that doesn't seem disgusting to me. And I went home that night and I was just like, ever the scientific minded one, I'm like, let's have a thought experiment here. Does this
Wow.
idea disgust me? No, this idea does not disgust me. In fact, it quite stimulates me. And then I had a panic, right? Because I was raised in a rural, even conservative evangelical context. And, but I also didn't have language or a concept of bisexuality. So I thought, well, I'm gay, but I'm also not gay. So maybe if I acted on it, I'd become fully gay. And so right now, and so again, not understanding bisexuality put me at risk of falling into the traps of, conversion therapy thinking and so forth.
Yeah.
And so I spent many years, even as a teen, again, this is pre-internet, finding every book I could get my hands on, almost all from Christian perspectives. What does this mean? And, they were like, here are the causes. Those things didn't resonate.
No.
And, in the meantime, I was slowly starting to come out to people with mixed results, mostly negative. Even when I was coming out saying, I don't want this, I think this is wrong, even then the treatment was often, fairly horrific.
Yes.
And, it probably wasn't until I was in my early 20s before I kind of understood that bisexuality was a thing. And even then it was a pretty tenuous understanding. But I'm grateful that I came to that, because in having an understanding of my sexuality in that way, when I did get into my marriage with my wife, it was on honest terms. I was honest with myself and I was honest with her. And not to say that that was easy, but I'm grateful because I know a lot of friends, both gay and bi, who've entered into marriages with people of a different sex, and prior to being honest about that, and it complicated things for them. They didn't feel like they were really making a free choice.
Right.
Whereas I feel blessed that I chose the person that I wanted to marry regardless of her gender.
Yeah. Wow. So for a while though, right, you kind of kept this to yourself.
Yep.
And then at some point you felt like you needed to be more open about that. Can I just ask, like, what made you feel like you needed to be open, and what were the pros and cons of that?
Okay, yeah. So there's probably a series of events that led to different levels of openness. Initially, my own experience with continually being harmed by people with the things they said and did. Like, for example, one of the common, thankfully it's going away, but it's still there, but one of the more common associations is correlating same-sex attraction, as the language was used, with pedophilia.
Yes.
Right. And so, I had one of my Sunday school teachers, who's one of my greatest inspirations as a teenager, say to me, if I found out one of the youth was gay, I would love them and support them and let them get the help they needed, but I probably wouldn't leave them alone with my kids anymore. And I was this woman's her kids' camp counselor. And I was just like, you're not someone I can come out to. And that night as a teenager, that was the first night I ever contemplated suicide, because I thought it would just be easier on everyone if I had a car accident, and I'm grateful I didn't. And I'm a large part of that is due to parents who were loving and supportive. But so I started seeing that harm to myself. But then I also, as I left home and joined Youth with a Mission right out of high school as a missionary, every single program that came through our doors, there was at least one student who had some kind of LGBTQ dynamic in their life, and I wanted to make sure that they weren't harmed either.
Right.
And so I started telling my story to try to invite people into better ways of having this conversation. And then over time, as my own thinking began to change, and it took many years, I eventually, after I was married and had been in ministry for over a decade and a half, I adopted an affirming position, but I was very private about it, and I kept that to myself. But again, there was a point where I felt I needed to be public about it. And that point was the Pulse shooting in Orlando.
Oh yeah.
And I started seeing Christians say things like publicly, yeah, this is bad, but And
But
then
they
of course
deserved
one,
it. Yeah, the Bible
right.
condemns it. Yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
exactly. You
Yeah.
know, and I'm not talking about the extremists. Those are bad enough, but easy enough to dismiss. But the people who kind of try to mitigate the victimhood because, you know, if they weren't there, they wouldn't, you know, and I finally felt, so I talked about it with my wife and said, I feel like I need to make a very clear public statement. And so I just on Facebook, I mean, I'm an author, so I have a bit of a social media platform, so a bit of reach. But when I posted this thing after the Pulse shooting, basically being clear that I'm affirming and that I'm, you know, that we need to be against this kind of talk, things changed overnight. Um, on a positive note, like I started receiving dozens of emails and Facebook messages from Christians all over the world, mainly in North America, basically saying, hey, I'm a pastor and I'm queer, but no one knows, or, you know, my kid is trans and I'm a Christian, but my church will never accept them, or, you know, I'm the head of a denomination and we're in the process of trying to change policies, but I don't even have any active relationship with someone I know is queer, and how can I, you know, and it just was, it ended up being so demanding in time that my church released me to half time focusing on that question.
Wow.
You know, and I was meeting with people one-on-one who were coming out, and, you know, for some of them that meant the end of their marriage, sadly, and a loss of their jobs, you know, a pastor in a fairly significant church. And it just was like, it was this incredible moment where a simple public statement resulted in this. And but the negative came not too long after, in that, you know, I actually received an award here in my province for my Christian advocacy work for LGBTQ people, and there was a couple of news stories featuring me. And while I tried to keep the name of YWAM out of it, because whenever I talked about this subject, I was very clear, like, YWAM has their beliefs and this is my personal, and the Canadian YWAM leadership had been very supportive of that division and given me the freedom to do that. It got too high up in the organization, and it started about a 2.5 to 3 year process, which ended in us leaving the mission in January. And while some people were very gracious and supportive in the process, others were horrific. While I wasn't named, I was cited alongside terrorism as a threat to the church by one of our international core leaders in a public prayer newsletter.
Huh.
You know, our founder has made comments that any teaching that affirms sin, he very clearly used the word affirmed, even though he didn't name that. He said, you know, this is a threat to the church and a threat to children especially. And God has given us an example of his response to that, and that's Sodom and Gomorrah.
Oh, great.
And it was heartbreaking, because this is a community I gave more than half of my life to. And while there was a small amount of support within the organization, ultimately it was becoming just horrific for our family, and we eventually chose to leave, and it's still costing us, right? Like we've taken a major hit financially, and you know, and but more than anything, it was the loss of relationships, people who we were as close to as family, and then just overnight, many of them just gone, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it would
Well,
be easy, I think it would be easy for me to like demonize this organization. Oh, they're just, you know, good riddance. But that's not my heart, right? Like, these are people who love Jesus and are trying to be faithful, but there's also this deep-rooted problematic way of understanding scripture and understanding God that is literally harming people, that is literally, you know, costing lives of young queer Christians.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that's something, and first of all, thank you for sharing that story. And it is sad. And I know you definitely have paid a higher price than I have. I mean, I got some pushback when I came out, you know, affirming, and wrote my articles and things like that, and continue to be affirming. But I haven't, you know, it hasn't had I mean, as far as I know, it hasn't had a significant impact on my, uh, you know, book sales or events or things like that. Now I have done some events where I've had local pastors, you know, try to spread the word. Oh, this guy's, he thinks, you know, God accepts, you know, homosexuals. And I've had people, you know, different podcasters and people like call me a heretic because of that, because I affirm. Um, And so, a little bit, but it's just kind of like this little snipey thing in the background. It hasn't been so bad, but it's still there. And I think what I've just tried to do is be consistent about, because again, this is what I try to do is frame it as like, I used to think like those guys. I used to believe what they believe for the same reasons. I know why they think that. It's because of Romans 1. It's because of 1 Corinthians, right? I know why you think that. And so, I've tried to, as lovingly and patiently as possible, whenever possible, point out certain things to those people, like just sort of like, did you know? Like, did you know the word homosexual never appeared in the Bible until 1946? I'm not making that up. That's the truth.
Yeah.
Go read the King James translation of the Bible, right? And look at those passages, and it will not say homosexual.
Yeah.
Because that word was added in artificially in 1946. And so, wow, well, that's weird. So these two different words in the Greek are synakotai and malakoi, which are translated in your English Bible as homosexual. Neither one of them have anything to do with being homosexual. Yeah. And so, I've tried to do that. But again, that only works if there's somebody who's open to, that's really? I didn't know that. And so they're open and they're interested, and maybe they're already kind of leaning that way, the way I was, where I wasn't comfortable with the behavior, but I was kind of still stuck on the scripture. But if somebody's convinced, and this is unfortunately the problem, if you're just already convinced, then nothing I say will change your mind, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's for me why I took a major shift in my life where and joining Generous Space is a great expression of that. But I wanted to spend most of my energy on the people who, like LGBTQ Christians, who needed support and community and love, and educating those people who want to understand. Yes, there's a time and place for the debate, but I just felt like I was giving so much time and energy to fighting and calling out people who weren't listening, that it's like, it was a waste of my time and energy. And
yes.
And so I think you're right. I think you need to identify those people who are genuinely trying to understand, who are genuinely conflicted. I spent many years conflicted, and invariably, especially when it relates to yourself, and your own identity, there's always that niggling little, doubt in the back of your mind, like, what if I am wrong? But it's kind of like, for me, that voice gets quieter and quieter over time as I see the fruit of flourishing in the lives of LGBTQ people as they embrace who God created them to be. But I also think one of the big dynamics that I'm recognizing, and I'm really grateful to Richard Beck in his work, Slavery of Death. I don't know if you've read his book, Slavery of Death.
I haven't read that.
That one is a really helpful one for me in that he talks about how the fear, that the existential and literal fear of death that drives us as humanity often pushes us to embrace kind of a heroic identity by being over and against the larger culture, and it's always rooted in a fear of death, in that, like, so anti-immigration, it's rooted, if we let these people in, we will not have enough, right? If we give up, marriage only being between one man and one woman, then eventually people will be marrying their dog. It's fear-based, right? And so, but then it's that kind of thinking is weaponized, where people are like, if you even question this, your place of belonging is threatened. And so if people are given a choice to go, if I can either be honest with what I'm believing and lean towards being affirming, but it would cost me my family, my friends, my church, they're not going to do it. And so that's why, for me, the commitment to making space, and again, Generous Space is really important about this, is to resist the impulse to feed into the strong conflict, the us versus them. Yes. Because if we want people to truly change, we need to invite them into something else, invite them into an alternative community where belonging is possible. And that has been my deepest passion, both with my church and with my work with Generous Space and in my writing.
Yeah. That's great. And then, yeah, it really is true. More and more, like I've been working with, my wife Wendy and I have been working with, and more with Muslims, and it helped trying to bring Muslims and Christians together in dialogue, not to try to prove who's right, not to debate theology, but just to really focus on what we have in common, um,
Yeah.
as a way of waging peace. And which I think, by the way, something Jesus would want us to do
Yeah.
and actually models for us. Um, but 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 it's very similar, like you said. It's recognizing the us and them mentality, and it doesn't matter what it is. The us is always us, but them is always those other people, and
Yeah.
we demonize them. We do create this false narrative about them, that the thing is, and we say things about them and believe things about them in this sort of scapegoating mechanism, right? But we can only do that if we've never met any of them. And
Yeah.
I don't mean just meet them. I mean, we've befriended them, right?
Yeah.
And so Woody and I saw this as well. Like when we used to, we worked for like 15 years in Southern California, working with homeless people and people living below the poverty line and living in motels and things like that. Um, and it's like once you know these people and you know their names and you looked in their eyes and you heard their story and their kids have played with your kids and all that, right? You befriended someone who's an other. You can no longer say yourself, all blank people are like this.
Yeah.
Right? You can't say all homeless people are lazy and they'll lie to you because they just want $20 and they'll make up stories and they're I'll say, because if someone says that to me, I'll say, well, no, my friend Jim is the most generous person I know, right? And he's homeless. No, they're not. They're not all that way. In fact, I know lots that are the opposite of that.
Yeah.
Or all Muslims hate our freedoms, want to impose Sharia law, they want to kill us. Like, well, no, they're not. My friend Abdul is an awesome, beautiful, amazing human being, loves his kids, loves America, loves Christians, and loves Jesus. Like, no, you should meet some. Or
Yeah.
all homosexuals they want to destroy the family.
Yeah.
I mean, again, you can only say those things if you've never actually spent any time with somebody and you get to know them. Because once you actually get to know someone, you cross that barrier to the other and you actually let down your guard and, learn to see another human being across the table from you. All of a sudden now, you can't play that game anymore. You can't accept those kinds of statements, and you yourself can't say those things anymore.
Exactly. And we have a saying in our church that is something of a truism that we tend to repeat, and that is, the seeds of liberation are planted across the table from one another as we break bread together. Like that is where change happens as we, and that's why both literally and symbolically, we share a meal every time we worship together, with the exception of Zoom right now,
Yeah.
which makes it difficult. But for 11 years, our community has done a potluck together every time we get together to worship, and it's been critical because it is in that space, and that to us is the center of worship, that hour of eating and just talking, where we begin to get past the pretenses that we build around ourselves and see the imperfect, beautiful trueness of one another, that we become community. And so I agree with you. And it's messy, right?
Yes.
Because it's not like you're going to do this and everything will make sense, because that's not how it works. Yes. Some of your homeless friends will lie to you just to get
Yes.
$20 out of you.
Oh, yes.
And you know what? You need to ask yourselves, what would lead a person to be willing to do that?
Right.
And what systemic problems have brought them to that place? And
Right.
that's when it pushes you deeper. When Jesus says, I was hungry and you fed me, we romanticize that. But it's like, Jesus says, I was in prison and you came visited me. Some people like to interpret that as the persecuted Christian in prison. But it's like, I don't know that Jesus was saying that. I think he was identifying with someone who had broken the law. And
yes.
And I think the Benedictines got that. I don't know if you've heard they have that the saying, when the stranger comes, Christ comes. And there's this story about, in the middle of the night, there's a knock at the door and the monk opens the door and there's this homeless person smelling and drunk and wanting a place to stay. And the monk responds, says, "Oh, Christ, it's you." I think that just so beautifully sums up the reality of yes, we discover Christ in the other, but let's not over romanticize that, because
Right.
when people encounter Christ in us, they're going to encounter our imperfections too.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, thank you. And that's a good point. Like about the, I think that's a great example of that, because that was our experience about working with people who are homeless and in poverty. So yes, we definitely had our eyes opened to our shared humanity and the beauty of, and I mean, my gosh, man, I never saw generosity in my life like I saw generosity, and because these people had nothing.
Yeah.
And many of them on a dime would just like, here you go.
Yeah.
I mean, things I knew they needed, but they saw somebody else in need and they were just so quick to share. But like you said, at the same time, I also saw people, sometimes because of addiction, to alcohol or to drugs, um, in their brokenness, come to me and lie to my face, and I would know they were lying. I know they're lying. I know they're making up a story because they want me to pay their rent, or they want me to buy their groceries, or they want to find a way to, work around some way that they can get something out of me. And then in those situations, my challenge is, can I love them in spite of that?
Yeah.
It's completely transparent. I know what they're doing, but can I look them in the eye and say, I know that isn't true. You don't have to lie to me. I love you. I want to help you. I want to bless you anyway, right? Just tell me the truth. And if you can't, okay. And I had situations like that where there was one guy would always lie about his background, and we all knew it wasn't true. And we'd even gently we took him out to dinner a couple of times and say, we love you even if you don't have this heroic background. It's okay. We just love you for who you are. And he would never let go of it. He could never admit it. And that was like, okay, that's fine. Right?
Yeah.
So you just learn to meet people where they are in their brokenness. It really becomes more of a challenge for us. Are we willing to look over that? Can we maintain a soft heart, even though we've been lied to many times, even though they rip us off many times? Like, that was always our challenge, like to not be jaded by that, to not get, to not tighten our grip because of that, right? But just to continue to have an open hand. And that just becomes a discipline, right, that you work through in the process.
Yeah, and we discovered that early on, especially when you're working in the urban context like we are. Mental illness is a very common reality for a lot of people, and we learned pretty early on that the kind of evangelical disciple so people become better mentality is not healthy or helpful.
No.
It's like this: will we love this person if they never change, right?
Yes.
Like, we're not going to allow people to harm others. We're going to always have safety, but our love and welcome for these people were not contingent on their achieving some kind of sanctification.
Yes.
Belonging is the fundamental commitment, the fundamental grace that God extends to us, and so how can we not extend it to others?
Right.
And that was for us. It took a big shift in our community to go, letting go of the evangelical training we had as kids that said you need to be Jesus to people, and shift to saying, no, you need to see Jesus in people.
Yes.
And suddenly our posture went from being paternalistic white saviors to suddenly servants who are humbled by the presence of the other.
Yeah, exactly.
And that was hard.
Yeah. Well, do you know who Jackie Pullinger is?
Yep.
Yeah, I got to meet her several years ago.
Oh,
I did an event with her. It was just a dream. It was beautiful. And that's one of the things, I learned from her. She does amazing work with homeless and drug addicted people in Hong Kong. That was like one of my favorite quotes from her. She says, the challenge was, can you love someone in that condition for the rest of their life, for their entire life, knowing in advance they will never become a Christian? Like, just take that off the table, that they're ever going to change. They're never going to become a Christian. They're never going to respond, but can you just love them anyway? And so then it becomes like, oh, it's just about loving them. It's about me loving them, not with this goal in mind, not this quid pro quo. Oh, I'm going to come and spend hours with you and pray with you and be Jesus to you. so that one day there'll be this, touchdown moment of, yay, we got one.
Yeah,
But
exactly,
it's like, yeah,
exactly.
even if they never did, could I do that? Because it's not, then it becomes more of a test of my heart. Am I willing to love people regardless, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And that's in many ways, if people can learn that lesson around things like poverty and mental illness, um, you know, it can sometimes be an entry point to recognize it's because the danger of that for us too is that we learn that and suddenly somehow think that we're being really really gracious and really um, magnanimous in our welcome of them regardless. But it's in that moment, hopefully, again, when we're talking about relationships and we're actually breaking bread with people and sharing life with them, that we recognize our mutuality with them, that we recognize that our brokenness is no more acceptable than their brokenness, right? And that their acceptance of us, and like I'm sure you experience, oftentimes especially in impoverished communities, they are way more likely to be radically welcoming than we are. And
Yes.
so it's that moment where you suddenly go, oh wow, I've been doing this as a discipline, and now I'm recognizing that it's in fact me who's been the recipient of incredible hospitality
Yes.
all along.
Yes. Yeah. And then thank you also for pointing out the thing about, like, because I was just checking real quick the Facebook feed, and some people had some great comments in there. And someone, Seth Showalter, said, why stress the brokenness? And it's like, well, for me, I'm not stressing their brokenness. Um, I'm acknowledging that when I see their brokenness, I can see my own.
Yeah.
Um, I think it was the recognition that, and God showed me this many different ways, um, that I needed Jesus just as desperately as anybody else did, right?
Yeah.
It's not like, oh, those poor people, I'm going to bring Jesus to them and fix them, right?
Yeah.
It was that, oh, no, I mean, my need for Jesus is just as great as theirs is. And
Yeah.
it's not about poverty, and it's not about addiction, and it's not about any of these other struggles and challenges. Um, and again, like you said too, the other beautiful thing about that whole dynamic, when we first went into that, it very much was, we're going to bring Jesus, we're going to bring the kingdom, right? We're
Mhm.
going to change the world, right? Um, and the truth was, through that process, people were radically transformed, but none more than us.
Yeah.
The ministry, we perceived ministry as coming from Jesus or from the Holy Spirit through us to them. But what we didn't expect was this tidal wave, tsunami, massive wave of ministry and love and transformation coming from them through the Holy Spirit back to us. That was the most radical thing. Um, and then it became more like, oh, there's more going on here than I thought.
Yeah.
I need ministry more than they do. Like I'm recognizing in myself things that need to be healed and changed and transformed and rearranged, right? Um, I think to me, that was the real meaning of when Jesus says, the poor you will always have with you. That's
Mm.
a grace.
Mhm.
That's a blessing,
Yeah.
because we need them, I think, more than they need us, right?
Yeah.
There's something we can learn in this process.
Absolutely. Yeah. I was actually just chatting with Brad Jerzak the other day about this, and I had a thought, and I was thinking about in the Chronicles account of the different tribes of Israel bringing their men together for battle, and it talked about how many each tribe brought this many thousand, and this tribe brought this many thousand, and then it was like, and then the sons of Issachar came with like 500 men who understood the times and knew what Israel should do, and it was like this moment of kind of like their number was small. They were the minority report, as Brad put it, and yet somehow in that minority experience they had an insight that was essential for the larger people of God. And I
Yeah.
think a lot of times that people who live on the margins and people who are marginalized by the church or by society often do come with some incredible truths. And so and that's why for me, one of the reasons I'm passionate about LGBTQ inclusion and affirmation in the church is that I believe that queer people bring a reflection of the image of God that is distinct and powerful, and that is timely in the world today, for the church today. And that's why it's like, yes, we don't all have to agree on theology, and we can find ways to disagree more graciously. But for me, not embracing the LGBTQ community into the body of Christ is to actually to reject an aspect of the Godhead.
Yes.
Reject an aspect of the divine. And that's where I think we all lose out then.
Yes, thank you. Gosh, that's beautiful, Jamie, because like we are cutting ourselves off from something good and something beautiful, right?
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, the church has a history of this, right? We cut ourselves off from women. Like we don't want to hear from the women, only the men can teach. Like, so 50% of the voices of Christ that we could be experiencing, we've shut ourselves off from that. Or people that are living in poverty, well, no, put them over there, stay over there. We'll do a drive-by, we'll bless you, but you stay over there. Right? We'll cut ourselves off from that. And then again, with the homosexual community and the LGBTQ community, there is a beautiful expression of Christ that we could be benefiting from, that could be nourishing the church and growing us in our understanding of Christ. But we've cut ourselves off from that part of the body. They are part of the body. They are our brothers and sisters in Christ. But when we push them off, marginalize them, shut them out, not give them a seat at the table, not allow them a voice, it damages them. Absolutely. It's damaging to them, but it's actually damaging to us as well. It's damaging to the church as a whole.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's the passion that I have. I keep bringing it back to my work with Generous Space Ministries, because I deeply believe in them, in us and what we're doing as a community. But even within our community, we've as a team have had to make commitments to anti-racism, because while we're focused really hard on LGBTQ inclusion, we're still a very white organization and have to be mindful of the intersection of race and within that. And so it's a lot of work. But again, it's worth it, because what we come out the other side with is a deeper connection to the divine and to one another.
Yeah, absolutely. And I probably should also make a statement, or give you a chance to respond to this too, because again, I'm listening to you and checking the comments. And Seth also made a really, I think, an important point, because he's gay as well. And he said, as someone who's gay, hearing us use that term brokenness can be painful or triggering. And so, and I'm glad for that comment, because I do this all the time. I say to people all the time who are gay, you're not broken. You don't need to be fixed. There's nothing wrong with you that you're gay. And so I don't want at all, as we're talking about people living in poverty and we're talking about brokenness and all that, I don't want at all to suggest that if you are gay, you're broken. And that's part of what needs to be fixed about you. So I don't believe that, and I don't want anyone to think that, because I think that's one of the very harmful messages that the Christian church, even sometimes when it's trying to be affirming, ends up sending.
Absolutely. And for those of us who grew up queer in the church, that the term brokenness was associated with our being, with our identity.
Yes.
And so even when we try to re-embrace a different understanding of brokenness, we need to be mindful of how that language still carries a lot of baggage. And for me, it certainly does. And so what I try to, when I speak of brokenness, I tend to think, rather than it being about something that I possess, it's something that I have been harmed by. The brokenness is something. So sin, again, that heavy word that has so much baggage, is, for me, it's anything that has disintegrated the relationship between God, self, others, and creation. That's anything that has broken down those connections. And so brokenness is something that we've all suffered, rather than something that speaks to our personhood. So I appreciate Seth pointing that out, because that's really, really important to differentiate. Because even in our best intentions, especially, I've experienced this with a lot of would-be allies to the LGBT community, is that comparisons are made between, something that is like negative behavior a poor moral choice, and then the experience of being queer, and it's just not a helpful parallel.
Right.
Even if it's like I'm trying to bridge the gap of understanding, it's like let's just do away with that kind of comparison, because it's not helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and then there was another comment one of my friends made here on the Facebook feed, and we haven't touched on this exactly, but it's probably good to say it out loud. There's also this assumption that being gay is a choice, and then that's part of where the language comes from, and the reorientation, and the different therapies to fix you if you're gay. It's all predicated on the assumption that you have chosen to be this way, and you should just, and so stop doing that. Choose differently. Don't be gay. Don't be trans. Don't be intersex. Don't be whatever. Like as if you could. And again, the people that I know that are gay and trans and all that, believe me, they have tried. Yeah. I don't think I know any of them that at least at some point in their struggle haven't tried and prayed as hard as they could to not be that way, because their parents and their church and everything were telling them that they shouldn't be, and that was wrong and bad and sinful and horrible, and God hated that, and it was abomination or whatever. And so, believe me, they've tried, and it can't be done, right? It is who you are, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, and even that word struggle is such a historically baggaged word for our community. And for me, it's like I come to recognize that I don't struggle with being queer, because when I embraced it was natural and healthy and good. What I realized what I was struggling with was trying to reconcile how God created me with an unhealthy Christianity.
Yes.
And the struggle was external to me. The causes were in a corrupted version, well-intentioned perhaps, but still a corrupted version of the gospel that tried to recreate me in man's image rather than in God's.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would love for the day, and I hope it's coming more and more, when the body of Christ can be part of the healing process, part of the welcoming process, part of the accepting and affirming and loving process of bringing people into the body of Christ, welcoming them into the body. Truly, it's not even welcoming and bringing them in. It's recognizing they're already here. I see that more and more, and I'm glad to hear your story and what you've been doing. I want to hear it more and more, though. I guess because I unfortunately hear the other side of that story a little too often.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Jamie. Now, do you have anything like I want to give people a chance to, and give you an opportunity to let people know if they want to know more about you and follow you. Do you have a blog? Do you have a book coming out? Do you have any things people can keep up with you? Anything you're excited about coming down the road?
Yeah, I mean, probably the best place to connect with all of the things, rather than me listing them all, is I'm on Facebook. I have both a personal and a professional page, Jamie Arpin-Rici. That is quite easy to find, and everything's open. And from there, I do have a blog. I write consistently on Medium, and I would encourage people to visit generousspace.ca to check out the ministry there. I think it's an incredibly powerful work that deserves more attention. As for books, I am currently working on a book on allyship, practices of allyship. Right now, I don't. It's very early stages. My writing career kind of was on the rise, and then I came out, and so I'm kind of starting over. You can find my previous books online on Amazon and stuff, but hopefully in the next couple of years that book will come out.
Well, Jamie, I've already talked to you about this before, but my publisher would love to have a first look at that book when you get it ready, because where the thing I love about my publisher, Choir, is that they've aggressively pursued authors and books and topics that other Christian publishers don't want and are afraid to publish. Choir is extremely open and brave when it comes to those kinds of voices, and I think it would be beautiful to have you in the family. So
yeah, well, I've a number of the authors, including yourself, are people that I follow and admire, so it's definitely an attractive option.
Yeah, so we'll stay in touch.
Absolutely.
All right, thanks, Jamie. God bless you, man. Keep doing what you're doing.
Thanks, you too.
All right.
Peace.
Love you. Bye-bye.